Hello, everyone. Let's get started with our webinar. Uh, I'm super excited to be joined by my good friend, Richard Owen, over here today from ONCX. And today we're going to talk about driving without a license. And we all have kind of built and run and operated NPS programs. But today what we want to talk about is the context of NPS programs. And so I am super excited about our guests over here. Richard and I have known each other for a few years now. Richard, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Thanks, Vivek.
All right. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Richard. You invented NPS, so I'm so happy that you're part of the webinar series that we're going to run. So at least you co-invented NPS. Tell us a little bit about your relationship with NPS, and we'll get started in a minute.
Yes, so my team at Satmetrics some 15 years ago did a joint project with Fred Reicheld and discovered NPS. I'm not sure whether you invent it or discover it or create it. I'm sure there's a technical difference between those, but it started off as a very simple methodology, and over 15 years now, we've been involved with training as well as implementation of NPS programs, and about 5,000 or 6,000 companies now have been involved in our process around this. So we've had a chance to see what works and what doesn't.
Awesome. Thank you so much. A little bit about myself. I started Question Pro almost 12 years ago, and we are not only a kind of CX platform. We have our roots are in market research and surveys, and we've built a pretty amazing platform for data collection, surveys, as well as tools and services around customer experience as well as employee engagement. So we'll get started right away in terms of agenda. So this is the agenda for today. We want to go over what NPS is really quickly, and more importantly, Richard is going to, through his vast experience, kind of guide us through some of the pitfalls and the issues why companies are doing it wrong. And then also we want to talk a little bit about some of the architecture that we've used here at Question Pro with multiple implementations. And we've also seen a lot of things that have worked from a very practical perspective, from a technology perspective, data collection models that have worked, and the data collection models clearly that have not worked. And so we want to go over that today. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Richard.
Okay, thank you very much, Vivek. Well, let me dive straight in. When I got the invitation to talk about driving without a license, I started thinking, well, that's probably a bad idea, but probably a more accurate analogy would be trying to fly a plane without a license, because the level of complexity and skill required to execute corporate transformation is more akin to flying an airplane, and I think we'd all agree it'd be a really bad idea if our pilots didn't have some sort of training behind what they're doing. And as the more astute of you can instantly observe, these two pilots are in really big trouble already, because for reasons best known to themselves, they haven't switched on any of their screens before they actually took off. But that's really secondary to the main point we're going to make here today, which is that the Net Promoter Score, whilst foundationally seeming very simple concept, really just about measuring the likelihood to recommend on this 0 to 10 scale, how much more complicated can it be, is actually quite difficult to master in terms of using it to drive corporate transformation. And thousands of companies have implemented some form of Net Promoter Score, but in many, many instances, it's more likely that they're trying to look like they're measuring NPS rather than actually doing anything to improve their Net Promoter Score. So what we hope to accomplish in a pretty short period of time here is guide you through some thinking about what some of the biggest mistakes people are making, and start to move you hopefully in a direction where you'll think differently about your Net Promoter Score program. Well, let me start with the first assertion we're going to talk about here, which is that companies don't really measure their NPS correctly. So this is sort of, again, we're using our metaphor of driving here. This is like saying, well, they couldn't figure out how to master the steering wheel. And you might be instantly thinking, that's crazy. This is really easy to measure. Well, let me try and persuade you otherwise in just a second. The second point, maybe the gear stick here, is even fewer of these companies that measure it really know how to improve it. And that's not just speculation on my part. We have data over 10, 15 years of benchmarks that show how little companies really do move their promoter score. So it's not just a matter of measurement. You won't get results. You have to actually do something somewhat differently. And finally, almost every company has some challenge in getting engagement from within their entire organization. Finding a way to get lots of employees to become part of this is an ongoing challenge for just about every organization, small and large. So these are the three big themes we're going to cover off in a little more depth. So let me dive straight away into the whole issue that many companies, majority of companies, I would argue, don't in fact measure their NPS score correctly. And I'm going to make some key points here, really 3 key points, and then I actually have a bonus fourth point, but I always prefer to say 3 rather than 4, so I'll stick to my starting point that there's 3 here. Wrong place. Well, what do I mean by this? Well, actually, what I'm really saying here is that people use the wrong kind of mechanism to measure their Net Promoter Score. And that can mean that they're measuring an event when they should be measuring a relationship. For example, they're focused almost entirely perhaps on trying to measure a support experience. And this is more common than you might think. Companies that go in and they ask at the end of every service event, would you recommend us? Well, if you do that, you're going to get a subset of customers to start with, and frankly, a subset of customers that are particularly unique because they're people who've experienced a support event. And it's an odd place to ask about whether or not someone would recommend. So this mechanism of measuring something transactionally is misapplied in this instance. And companies have a lot of trouble figuring out, do we measure the overall relationship or do we measure particular events? And depending on the type of business model that you're in, the answer might vary. So companies that are doing a lot of repeat business with customers clearly shouldn't summarize the whole relationship with one particular event, whereas companies that have maybe only a one-off event might be perfectly valid in measuring it at that particular point in time, maybe transactionally, maybe triggered by that one event. So companies choose the wrong mechanism more often than you might realize, and that means the score is going to be radically different. There's a lot of difference between measuring it one way or measuring it another. And so you could be looking at it from a completely wrong perspective. The second thing is people choose the wrong time. Now, it might seem like there's always a good time to ask people, but as a matter of fact, it depends on your particular brand promise that you've got. Let me give you an example. If your brand promise is to be the world's greatest electronic commerce supermarket online, for example, then a perfectly legitimate way of measuring it might be after someone completes the purchase of the product. And that's really will test the online purchase experience. But if you consider your brand to include the delivery logistics, part of it is getting it to people's homes, then measuring the NPS before it's arrived at the house is clearly not delivering the full brand promise. Well, let's go a step further. Let's say your brand promise was to actually deliver a great product. So you actually own the manufacturing of the product as well. Well, you want to have people actually use your product before they can say whether or not you've delivered on that brand promise. So within that 3-step sequence of purchasing online, shipping, and consuming the product, there are 3 potential ways you can measure it, but only one of them captures the full brand experience. The other 2 basically are very partial and could give you very, very different results. And so you could be measuring it in the wrong time. And the general rule of thumb is you always want to measure at a time when the customer has had exposure to the entire value of your brand promise. Anything before that, and you're sort of missing something. One of my favorite stories of companies that actually measure it before they send the bill to the customer. So it's say, how are you doing? Would you recommend us? Oh yes, that's great. Now here's the invoice. How do you feel now? Well, maybe not quite as good. Third question is, are you measuring the right people or not? Now, this is often less of a problem in consumer markets because we have a habit of sort of assuming homogeneity amongst consumers. We say, well, they're all kind of the same. But even in consumer businesses, companies do lots of different segmentation. They have high-value customers, they have low-value customers. And if all you're getting is people responding who are from one segment, then you're probably kidding yourself about your business. Let's imagine that out of all the people who give you a recommend score that's very, very high, so that promoters, all of those people turn out to be your least profitable customers. And the people who are the most profitable customers don't respond to your surveys at all. Well, you're going to have a very distorted view of your business performance. You're going to be quite disappointed at the future growth if you're delighting unprofitable customers and you just don't know what's happening with your profitable customers. So segmentation of customers and understanding who's responding is a really critical element. And our bonus point, and I'm trying to be humorous here by basically adding this rather long and wordy statement, is that in B2B, business-to-business companies, all rules are off because customers are not typically homogeneous. There's a lot of heterogeneity amongst business-to-business customers. And so you have, if you like, a portfolio of customers, all of whom have quite different customer lifetime value. And depending on who responds and when, you may get very, very different NPS. Depending on how you treat individuals within those accounts, you may get very different results. Let me give a practical example. Imagine if the only people who respond to your surveys are people who aren't really decision makers in the company. They may all love your product or service, but at the end of the day, they're not the decision makers, so you may still lose the business. And you may say, well, that's crazy. Look, our NPS score is really high with this company, but they fired us as a vendor. Well, it's high amongst the people who don't matter. And so business to business has a lot of customer response segmentation types issues you have to think through to make sure you're getting the right people. So all this is solvable with the right kind of focus on getting the right mechanisms in place, figuring out when you should measure, understanding really the target audience and who's responding. And then in business to business, something of a more complex problem that's, again, fairly solvable with some thought about targeting different segments.
Hey, Richard, I have a question for you. Hey, Richard, I have a quick question for you over here. I absolutely love the kind of the divergence from that you're talking about versus B2B versus B2C. Can you help us understand when you guys started NPS, or at least when the metric was at least kind of envisioned, it was largely a consumer-driven metric, correct? And in today's business, I mean, I can think about it in our environment where we have different classes of customers, especially, we sell only to businesses, and even within those classes of customers, we have, various kind of personas that clearly make a huge difference. Have you guys thought about how to kind of really kind of tackle the loyalty metric in the B2B context versus the B2B context? Can you help us understand that?
Sure. So there's good news and there's bad news. So the bad news, if you like, was when the original NPS research was done, it was all based on consumer markets. And that was because that's where the data was available at the time and it was the easiest to analyze. And so there really was no work done to demonstrate that any of this worked in B2B at all. The good news was that over the next 10 years, companies continued to prove back to us that it really did work. And so lots of companies were saying, well, our customers who are promoters have higher economic value, they're growing faster, they have lower cost to serve. So we know this is working, but the methodology is not at all clear. And so increasingly we are starting to look at the degree to which a B2B methodology can be applied. And some of this is about weighting and making decisions around how individuals and accounts should factor. And some of it is about calculating essentially a business company net promoter score as opposed to individuals. I mean, one of the biggest differences, say, between CRM and customer experience approaches is CRM deals with the single unit as being the business, whereas in our space it tends to be individual. So we're working to reconcile these two, and we have a methodology around that. It's probably worth a webinar in its own right just to explore how that works, because B2B can get quite complex. What people need to know is, number one, it does work in B2B. There's enough data around that. But you've got to be very, very careful about the representative sample that you're looking at within these companies, and don't assume homogeneity. Think of every business-to-business account as somewhat unique that you want to take a look at and understand the dynamic within the account.
Got it. And I would imagine, the same model applied with like a complex set of weights would probably yield better results effectively, right? Yeah, I think so. And I think that, ultimately people have done some quite sophisticated modeling and come up with better results. But in the short term, the thing to avoid is just misfiring and measuring completely the wrong audience within your customer, right? I mean, it can be as simple as going, look, are we getting responses from key decision makers here? So we're not sort of biasing our outcome. Got it. Yep. Keep going. Awesome.
So, so if it's this challenging to measure, you can imagine that people are having an even harder time trying to figure out how to actually improve their NPS. And the thing I would say here, and this is rather a complex chart, I know, and I lifted this straight from the masterclass certification, but essentially, the best way to understand improvement is to see it as a series of choices. What is it that in your business you're going to choose to focus on? Not everything in the customer journey has the same impact on the creation of promoters or detractors, right? Some things are hygiene factors. In other words, they really don't have any particular impact unless you get them wrong. Some things are, highly leveraged. We like to call those sometimes moments of truth. And if it's moments of truth, then it means that these are things you absolutely have to get right. So we know that it's a very uneven universe. Different things in your customer journey matter very differently. We also know that phases of the customer life cycle matter differently. For example, the early life experience can be incredibly important in most industries. Why is that? Well, most customers are matching their expectations to reality in this early life phase. This is when they're trying to figure out, did I make a horrible mistake, or is this something really awesome that I ended up purchasing? And depending on the nature of the product, the gap between expectations and reality can be quite difficult to close. Some simple products, for example, like automobiles, you're probably not that surprised when you drive an automobile home. You've test driven it, you kind of know what it looks like, how it feels to drive. You've driven lots of automobiles. There's not really a big surprise in early life unless you're unlucky enough to have a lemon. If you contrast that, for example, with business-to-business software, business is near and dear to both our hearts, correct? In many instances, the customer doesn't really fully understand the capabilities of the product when they buy it. They discover a lot about it in the early life experience. Maybe that's part of implementation or configuration. Maybe it's just getting to grips with the full capabilities of the product. So this early life experience is incredibly important, it turns out, because if you botch that, you very rarely recover. Most companies discover that things don't get any better if you don't get the early life right, because you're really getting these expectations right. So that's an example of a sort of time-weighted view. But even within that lifetime, all the different customer journey points can impact NPS in quite different ways. If you really want to geek out on this, the most comprehensive way of looking at this is the Staccato model, or penalty reward approach, which really divides different aspects of these experiences into penalty factors, things that basically you don't get any credit for, but if you mess them up, the customer's very unhappy with, or reward factors where a customer doesn't expect it, but if you deliver it, you really delight them. All of this, however, comes to some one basic idea. Different elements of the journey are worth different things to your customer, and your choice to improve things is figuring out which ones of these are going to have the leverage, how to focus on them, and then how to direct your activities to the few things that really make a difference and ignore the ones that don't.
I can tell you, I can jump in right now. I can tell you from our own experience and our own research, and as you pointed out, Richard, in B2B SaaS software, which is what we sell, onboarding is probably the most important element of our customer lifecycle. And I think it's true for all software platforms and all software systems for exactly the reason why you said. People kind of have a good idea of what they're buying, but it's the implementation, it's the onboarding and the implementation. And whenever we botched up on onboarding and implementation, we pretty much lost the customer. And every time we made sure that the onboarding and implementation and the first 3 months are amazing, then we've kept the customers for pretty much their entire lifetime. So that's a great kind of point around a time axis around this. We've not thought about that, but definitely it's something to. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, and I think software is a particularly acute case because, as you say, the connection between the customer knowledge of the product and the product itself is quite acute. But I mean, I think lots of industries have really invested in early life experience. I mean, you look at consumer products now you buy. Maybe you buy a Samsung product or an iPhone. You look at the packaging. I mean, it's beautiful. You open this box, and it's gorgeous, and you're going to throw it away in about 10 minutes. So the customer, you're buying, a year or two's use of a technology product, but the company's invested enormously in this first 30-second image, which is going to stick with you. And look, this is based on basic human behavior. We respond. We have a lot of biases, and one of our bias is we tend to remember the first part of an experience and the last part of experience. There's another way of looking at this that's often referred to as the peak-end rule, which is we tend to remember the high point of our experience and then the last thing that happened to us. If you think about movies, why do movie makers focus so much on the opening and the end? One of the masters of this was George Lucas. Star Wars was all about the first 10, 15, 30 seconds because George Lucas knew that that's when you get people. And so we're sort of deeply programmed to work this way. It's not just about products and services, it's about human nature. So let me move on to the third point here, which is organizational engagement. And, you know, this stems from a very basic notion here that any world-class organization at delivering CX that we would use as an example, typically one of the most notable aspects of it is that you have all these employees pulling in the same direction. You know, you talk about the team, and the team is superb. The team is really committed to customers, almost customer obsessed. And we often call that culture, and we say that's just their culture, right? They figured that out. They must have got something right. Well, you know, I think that I'd like to give you a different thought around that. And I think it starts from the fact that NPS is a bit like a Rorschach test. If you say it to people, everybody thinks they understand what it is. And so if you asked people around you in the business, they would all say, oh yeah, I know what NPS is. And then you sort of move on. Well, we understand it. Let's move on. The reality is every time we do research in a company as to what it means to be customer-centric, what it means to improve NPS, even what NPS really is about, we find that the opinions vary quite dramatically between different groups in the company, and even within those groups quite dramatically. There's no great consensus within the business as to what NPS is all about and what should be done to improve it. So if you have everyone sort of with this notion, they all think they agree, but nobody really does, you're not really building a solid foundation for getting engagement. Now, there's more to employee engagement than just getting everybody to understand the meaning of NPS, but clearly it's a pretty important requirement. And I'll give a couple of examples of this. So first of all, retail is a classic one. The number of retailers I've seen who would say in their annual report, the chief financial officer basically reports to Wall Street that they have an NPS. And they'll say it's a corporate-wide metric, bonus plans tied to it. And walk into a retail store and ask an employee, and I've done this, what is NPS? And some will say, well, it's a company metric. We're measured on it. What does it mean? I have no idea. Or, you know, maybe they don't even know it exists. And I think that gap is extremely important, because if you can't get employees engaged in customer experience at the place they come into contact with customers, you're not going to get great results, especially in employee-intense businesses like retail or hospitality or airlines or any of these businesses where the delivery mechanism for CX is the employee base. Another observation around this disconnect comes from slightly different alignments of interest. So as you can imagine, if you go into the executive suite, their notion of why a company is doing NPS could be quite different than if you went into, say, a contact center and you asked an employee there. In many ways, the contact center employee might be thinking of a CX initiative as being predominantly a way to make their job easier to help them delight customers. That's not an unrealistic way to think about it. In fact, that's a great way to think about it. Why can't we make it easier for our employees to delight customers? That's a pretty good goal of a program. If you go to the boardroom, not surprisingly and not unrealistically, they're asking questions like, can you show me how NPS connects to economic value creation? Can you link it financially to lifetime value of our customers? Can you show me how investments we might make in the business to improve it are going to pay back? These are good questions for boards to ask. So understanding how to answer questions that frontline employees need answered, give them the skills they need, as well as the boardroom, is necessary to get everyone aligned. So when we talk about alignment, we're talking about multiple levels, getting everyone on the same page. I think it's achievable for companies, and it's a characteristic of just about every company that we've seen become successful. So I'll leave you with one last thought, and this is not as dark as it seems with the plane crashing here. I don't mean to be overly dramatic, but I just want to share one observation, which was about how they actually do train pilots to fly in North America. And one of the things they don't train pilots to do, or they don't require you to have as a skill as a pilot, is to learn how to recover from putting the plane in a spin. And you might think, well, that's a pretty bad idea. If the plane goes into a spin, it'd be great if the pilot knew how to recover. But interesting enough, the FAA decided years ago that any pilot that has such poor skills that they would put the plane into the spin in the first place is almost certainly not going to be able to recover. Now, if you think about the business equivalent, it's pretty much saying, look, if you don't have enough skills to put a basic program in place, then you're probably not going to be able to turn one around once you've made a mess of it. By far and away, the best thing companies can do before they even launch NPS programs is to build the right kind of approach, the right kind of technology infrastructure, the right kind of methodology, so that they will be successful and they won't put themselves in a customer experience spin. Because once you get into it, it's darn hard to get out of.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much for that. That makes a whole lot of sense. I want to jump in and kind of like just recap the three important things that you said that clearly kind of stuck onto me, which is, measurement, improvement, and engagement. If there are, if you look at any NPS program, what you're saying is like really think hard about measurement, think about improvement, and then think about engagement. And engagement, obviously, internal as well as external engagement. And to that end, we've kind of put together some key components that that we think are important. That if you look at these 6 items over here, they all kind of they all map back to either measurement, improvement, or engagement. And the first one is around targeting customer segments. Richard talked about it earlier on, and we've seen it time and again where we want to measure everything. When you start measuring everything without clear segmentation, it becomes a challenge. So especially like we talked about in the B2B context, you have high value customer, low value customer, and customers, and you need to kind of really understand who you're trying to measure. In terms of improvement, we always recommend, and Richard has also recommended that implement a NPS playbook. What do you do when you collect the data? How do you react to it? Do you have a closed loop system to actually improve CX scores? Collecting data and reporting it to the board is one thing, and using that operational data to actually drive change at the ground level. These things require internal coherence within an organization. Along with that comes defining roles. What happens when you collect data? Who does what within the organization to actually improve NPS scores? Do you have a monthly cadence with certain key stakeholders that can actually improve the experience capability in the company? So these are a whole host of questions that do come up as you think about it. And we've kind of put together these 6 items that enable most successful NPS programs to kind of, they've thought at least a piece of that has been thought through. I'll jump right into kind of how we've seen, it's a fairly complex slide over here, but how we've seen kind of at least transactional systems really work. And I'm going to walk you guys through really quickly as to how we at Question Pro implement from a technology stack perspective really an integrated system. The first questions one of the few questions I get asked a lot of times is, hey, what's the difference between a survey platform and a CX platform? And while a CX platform largely is fundamentally based on a survey, it's kind of the front end of the system effectively. And as you can see, most CX programs have some sort of a kind of internal kind of transaction, which Richard talked about, is what's your touch point. You have to kind of really understand which touch point you're trying to measure. Like you said, if your brand promise is to deliver a great product, you do have to wait till the product experience is executed. I'll give you a quick example. In the case of Emirates, the brand promise is an amazing experience while you're flying. So no point sending out a survey, pre-flight. It's really after the flight, after the experience is delivered, can we measure, hey, was this good to go or was that not? And in most systems, the data and the metadata associated with those events are spread within an organization. We usually collect it through an API or a batch or an FTP process on a weekly, nightly, daily basis. We do some data cleansing on our side, especially around resting period and look back rules, which say like, look, if somebody is just using your service and you don't want to over survey them, and these business rules can be applied. And the one thing that I do want to mention here that has worked really well for us is using both email and text messaging as a delivery platform. And we use it smartly. We first send out the email. We don't get a response within a couple of days. We send out a text message, and then collect the data. Once the data is collected, obviously it goes into a series of dashboards, and which is what we believe that there are multiple stakeholders involved. There's the kind of the executive and the journey dashboards, as well as operational dashboards. People who are on the ground, they need data, and as well as they need information so that they can actually affect change in real time. And that's where our promoter amplification and detractor recovery, the closed loop system that comes with it. So as you can see, it's more than just a survey. It's kind of an entire system designed to measure, collect, and improve the experience. So does that mean, if you're doing these transactional surveys, do we stop doing these relationship surveys also? Obviously we believe there are two different elements to it. We have a closed loop operational system, and then a larger, what we call a smart loop, a relationship based model where that there's no a single point of transaction that occurs. You are measuring the relationship between your promise and your experience effectively, and that can be done kind of on a different cadence. That can be done on a weekly, monthly, daily, quarterly, yearly basis, really depending upon the kind of the interaction elements that are taking place, really depending upon the business. So our kind of model around this is, you have a transactional model that is operational, and then a relationship survey that is more strategic, that is more well thought out, and one can be larger than the other. The two of them don't have to be exactly the same, but one can be larger than the other.
Absolutely right, Vivek. I mean, I think that that type of approach is the right way to think about it. I think companies who are thinking about NPS need to be able to both measure operationally the transactional touch points, and they need to understand their overall relationship structure and pull those two data sets together to make sense of the whole thing. And I think that's, the sort of minimum requirement now to be able to build a really good insight into how you're executing with your customers. So I think you completely got that right. For our part, we're now focused a lot on how to get that alignment and organizational engagement. And so we've been bringing out new modules around the Net Promoter Masterclass. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, the Net Promoter Masterclass is the latest iteration in Net Promoter certification, which is now getting on about 10 years old. There's about 6,000 companies have been through this and certified professionals. So it's by far and away the largest type of professional certification product of its kind in the world. But this is a whole new reinvented version, and we've really brought it out in three forms. The first one, the Net Promoter Masterclass, sort of in the middle here, is the classic version updated really for the digital age, and it's focused on industry professionals who really want to understand how to master the skills around Net Promoter Score. It's a pretty intense program, some 40 hours of material, but at the end of the day, you get the certification, which really credentializes you to be a professional in the space. The Executive Masterclass takes the form of a half-day workshop amongst a senior group of leaders in the company, somewhat more customized to the nature of the business, you can imagine, more interactive, and much more focused on the topics that's really relevant for that group. And companies use this as a mechanism to get their senior team fully aligned around this. There's some data collection in advance, but ultimately it's about this highly immersive interactive session for senior leaders whose company is really spearheading this. But probably the most exciting part of this is the third piece, which is the All Hands on Deck product, which is about to get launched in just a week or so. And that is really a mechanism for training and engaging every single employee in the entire company. And so this is not a 40-hour investment of time. This is more like a 50-minute investment of time. But it gets every single employee in the business to a level of basic understanding around Net Promoter Score that really supports the program. So no more cases where it's part of someone's bonus plan, but they don't understand what you're talking about. So this is really what we're focused on, is getting this level of collective alignment within the entire organization.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for that. Thank you for that context. Also, organizational alignment. That's the next part of our three-part webinar series around CX. And we all know, and we all know that organizational alignment is one of the most important pillars in the three-pillar strategy that we talked about around measurement, improvement, and engagement. So we look forward to kind of having you back, talk about kind of how to engage the organization effectively. It's definitely a lot of components from the masterclass will be here. So we'd love to have everybody back here. We'll send out an email when it's about in about a month's time. We'll have the second part of our three-part series. Thank you, Richard, for coming in and appreciate your time.
Thank you.